will steal money from Haiti and invest in the U.S.
So people who support Tonko and Jumai 5, over half of them don't have a voter's card.
Sounds like Nigeria.
Join Ireti Bakare-Yusuf on Borderlines as she engages with policymakers and thought leaders,
giving you perspectives and insights you won't find anywhere else.
Be part of the conversation. Join us live.
Your voice matters on Borderlines as we explore the complexities.
Every Friday at 4 p.m.
on 99.3 Nigeria Info.
Stay informed, stay engaged.
Step into the conversation.
Hello, good afternoon, Lagos, Nigeria, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Ireti Bakare-Yusuf. Welcome to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. So we have a very interesting show today because a lot of you have been asking for us to really try and delve into Russian-Ukraine war. You know, even if possible, we're going to go into the back history of it, etc., etc. So, for that reason, I have somebody that's something of an expert. He is a visiting professor at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies in Harvard University. He's also a visiting professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. He was previously a professor of practice in Russian Studies in Political Science Department and Center for Russia, East Europe and Central Asia at the University of Wisconsin. His name, and I'm going to try and pronounce it the right way, is Mikhail Troitskiy. Mikhail, did I get it right?
It works, for sure.
No, tell me, how should I pronounce it?
Thank you for trying. Well, you could say Mikhail Troitskiy.
Mikhail,
like Gorbachev.
Yes.
Gorbachev.
Yes, Mikhail Gorbachev. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on Borderlines on Nigeria Info.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Is this your first time on Nigerian radio, media, TV?
Yes, it is. My first exposure ever to Nigeria, as I'm sorry to say.
Oh, well, there's nothing to be sorry about. We're proud. We're proud to be the first ones to bring you here. So, you're an expert, obviously. You're Russian, going by your name. Let me give you 2 minutes because we have a lot of listeners on this show who have been wanting us to do, to talk more about the Russian-Ukraine war. We've talked about it once in the past, but of course it's taken center stage now, given what's going on with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And of course, on the other side, we have Ukraine, Zelensky, and we have the EU. But first and foremost, let's go back. Give us like a 3-minute summary of the history back to the Soviet Union, to the USSR, when they were all part of one big family.
Yeah, well, Ukraine has long been part of the Slavic cultural space, so to say. However, it was usually apart from Russia if you look at Russia as a state centered in Moscow. In fact, a state centered in Kiev, the contemporary capital of the state of Ukraine, used to be, all in Russia would agree, the precursor of Russia as an independent and unified state with the capital in Moscow. But let's not go too deep in history. So already in the 19th century, when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, living under Russian Tsar, as Poland and Lithuania and other countries, contemporary independent, were at that time. So in the 19th century, Ukraine began developing a strong sense of national identity that certainly predated the 19th century. But the 19th century was the run-up to the Bolshevik Revolution in the Russian Empire that happened in the midst of a great war of World War I. So the Russian Empire collapsed, and at that point, Ukraine just bid for independence. And it was independent for a couple of years during the upheaval, the civil war in Russia, in the Russian part of the former Russian Empire. But then Ukraine was brought back to the fold, one can say, by the Bolshevik army, by the Red Army. And in December 1922, Ukraine joined what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a republic on par with Russia and a few others. So Ukraine was indeed part of the Soviet Union, but it was a separate, a constituent republic, one of the 15 republics, as they ended up being towards 1950s. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, essentially imploded in 1991, Ukraine became an independent state. In the borders that existed at that time within the Soviet Union, some of those borders were not very clearly demarcated. Some of them were not demarcated. And of course, some people in Moscow began feeling nostalgic about the times when Ukraine was one country with Russia. And certainly over the 3 decades since the breakup of the USSR, Ukraine has been developing a very strong sense of identity, which of course, in many cases, they built in contrast to Russia. So they would say, we are Ukrainians because we are not Russians. But of course, again, the Ukrainian identity went back centuries, and there was no doubt that Ukraine was a distinct country, and it certainly was and is an internationally recognized independent state. So Russia under Vladimir Putin, after 2 decades of Putin's rule in Russia, attacked Ukraine because at that point, apparently Vladimir Putin and his close associates decided they want to move forward, reunifying what they thought were the Slavic, at least the Slavic republics of the former Soviet Union. Maybe they might have thought about annexing other territories from countries like Kazakhstan and Central Asia, because they believe those countries belong to Russia, those territories belong to Russia historically, as long as they were populated by Russian speakers. So the bottom line is that in February 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine, an independent state that had already by that time developed a strong sense of identity, where people did speak Russian on par with Ukrainian, but they were Ukrainian citizens. They were recognized as such by the international community, and so the war started. And now we are 3 years into this war with a new administration and a new president in the White House in the United States trying to put an end to the war. And that has become indeed very personal for Donald Trump to be able to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine for the reasons we can only
go into it.
Guessing about, but we are going to discuss it. So
yes.
I just gave you the background.
The general summary. Thank you so much. You will be able to call us on 0201 277 0993 0201 465 7190. But as my conversation with Mikhail continues, you can send a WhatsApp message to 0809 597 5805. We are streaming live on YouTube, Nigeria Info, and on Facebook. So let's continue. Thank you so much for that background. From what you said, this is not the first time that Ukraine has tried to break up from Russia, correct?
Well, I mean, history is a tricky thing to talk about. So we can start from, say, the 16th century, when Ukraine was partly living under Polish-Lithuanian rule and partly was independent in the south. And then at some point, some Ukrainian leaders in the 17th century became disillusioned with life under Poland, and asked Moscow, the center of the Russian state at that time, to just join Russia, to be accepted into Russia. So Russian historians like to kind of trace the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations back to that moment when a Ukrainian leader requested to join Russia. But no doubt that since then, and until the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine was indeed very tightly connected with Russia. Although it was developing its national identity, and it has had its distinct language and distinct culture and literature, it was indeed intertwined with Russian culture and literature. Many Ukrainians came to work in rose up the ranks in an empire, and vice versa. Russians went to work and live and marry into Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine has always, there's no doubt, Ukraine has always had a distinct identity. So in different forms, they coexisted under the Soviet Union. Again, the Soviet Union had its capital in Moscow, and Kiev, the capital of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, was a big city, a major center, a major urban center in the Soviet Union, in its East European part. And no doubt the Soviet rulers did tinker with Ukrainian borders and actually helped Ukraine gain territory in the West at the end of the Second World War. So Ukraine got some territory that used to belong to Poland, and some to Hungary and Slovakia. But I mean, that was the end of a major war, of a world war. So since then, Ukraine existed in its borders within the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union broke up, it just became an independent state, just like other 14 former Soviet republics. Okay,
one of the things that's been widely, which Vladimir Putin actually constantly repeats, or at least repeated up until 2022, when the war broke out, was Mikhail Gorbachev had said that there was a promise that NATO would not veer towards Russian boundaries. And for Vladimir Putin, NATO wanting to take Ukraine into NATO meant NATO could build a NATO base in Russian borders. Talk to us about that promise, which, by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev had said wasn't written. Either it was spoken, it was understood, but certainly it wasn't written. There are those who say it was true. There are those who say it's not true. What do you think, as somebody that's an expert?
Yeah, so at the point of the implosion of the Soviet Union, when things were going really badly for the USSR economically, Mikhail Gorbachev, kind of realizing all of that, having to come to terms with all of that, had to navigate the events, essentially the uprisings that were ongoing in the countries of Eastern Europe that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. So at that point, and especially when Germany began reunifying in late 1989, so 11/9, the 9th of November 1989 was the date when the Berlin Wall fell. So at that point, Gorbachev had to negotiate reunification of Germany. And during those negotiations, at some point, Gorbachev and his associates might have discussed the terms of the membership in NATO for the reunified Germany and potentially the future of NATO. So Gorbachev's assumption was that once the Soviet Union transformed and reformed its foreign policy and became friends with the West, with NATO, NATO would no longer be needed. But that was his dream, in a way, pipe dream. So at the end of this process, NATO decided it had no reason to actually disband, although, again, the East European bloc that the Soviet Union presided over during the Cold War, of course, collapsed. And then the Soviet Union itself collapsed. But NATO just stayed. And then over the 1990s, we saw this process of requests for admission to NATO made by those former Soviet satellites, former Soviet allies in Eastern Europe. And so this process climaxed in 2004 when 3 former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, joined NATO. But then NATO focused largely on the Balkan Peninsula, integrating countries like Croatia, Albania, and others. And so there was never a plan to integrate Ukraine into NATO. Before 2014, Ukraine even had it in its constitution that it would maintain a blockless status. It won't be seeking membership in military or defense alliances or military blocs, neither with Russia nor with NATO or anyone else, with the United States. In 2014, Russia went ahead and seized the peninsula of Crimea.
Yes, that was going to be my next question. We come forward to Crimea.
But to finish answering the question about NATO, at that point, Ukraine reconsidered and said, we indeed want to join NATO. And they applied to join NATO. However, NATO was very reluctant to even, play with the prospect of Ukrainian membership. So nothing, even by 2022, which was 8 years down the road from the annexation of Crimea, even in 2022, it was very hard to imagine Ukraine joining NATO. There were so many hurdles, there were so many countries opposed to that membership, that although the prospect of membership was indeed somewhere, but it was so remote, and that again, it's a very risky proposition, and it is untrue to say that at that point NATO was absorbing Ukraine at Russia's expense, thereby posing a security threat to Russia. And finally, remember that, of course, Ukraine began seeking membership in NATO in a serious way after Russia moved and took away a piece of internationally recognized territory from Ukraine in 2014.
Here's the thing about the Crimea, though. It is said, and I've read this in many analysts will tell you that there was a vote and many Crimeans chose to stay with Russia. So because we've still got so much to cover, if that's the case, then given that they were all part of one, if you like, union, big land, if a people choose to stay with, if you like, the historic country, is there anything wrong with that? Or was that not true?
Yeah, so was there popular support among the residents of Crimea within Ukraine for joining Russia? Perhaps. It's hard to actually estimate how strong it was. Was it around 50%, 30%? You never know. So the bottom line here is that unmarked Russian troops moved into Crimea first and, essentially seized it. And then the referendum was conducted at gunpoint. And then you get 98, 97% of Crimean residents who vote to join Russia.
If I may interrupt you, what do you mean by the referendum was conducted at gunpoint?
Well, it means that, Russian troops were in Crimea. So Crimea was at the point when the vote was held on joining Russia. Crimea at that point was de facto Russian-controlled territory.
Okay.
And even if you accept the outcome of that referendum, I mean, from the perspective of international law, if you just start allowing regions in any country to just take votes freely for independence or maybe joining another country, then I mean you'll get a mess. So international law is there to put restrictions on this kind of outcomes, unless Ukraine allowed to hold such a referendum. This referendum would never become legal and even legitimate. So if someone moves into your country and then asks citizens of a neighboring area to vote for independence, then it doesn't look fair. Despite of course the proclivity of some of those residents to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. But how many of those there were truly, you would never be able to estimate.
Okay, so here we are. Putin declares war. Again, let me just go back before we go forward. Before war broke out, one of the things, and this was around when Angela Merkel was still the Chancellor of Germany, there was a lot of push for a diplomatic solution, right? I think Putin himself also wanted a diplomatic solution. He would say, I don't want to go to war. I'm paraphrasing, of course. France, at some point, also supported a diplomatic solution with Angela Merkel. But however, as soon as Angela Merkel left, that diplomatic solution fell apart with Boris Johnson, Biden, etc. Why couldn't there have been a diplomatic solution? Or perhaps I should rephrase it. If there were a diplomatic solution that could have put a stop to this war, what would that diplomatic solution have been?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because Moscow was not totally clear as to what would have satisfied it, what would have prevented Russia from going to war with Ukraine. So the best sort of documentary evidence we have from the time when the war started are the two draft treaties, as they were called, that were proposed by Russia to the United States and to NATO, respectively. And basically, those draft treaties asked for demilitarization of Ukraine, for guarantees of Ukraine's non-accession to NATO ever. And they also contained demands with regards to actual NATO members in Europe. So Russia wanted essentially NATO to roll back to its 1997 borders. That was another point in time when NATO and Russia made a deal. So essentially, Russia was asking to expel a few East European countries from NATO, which was a non-starter for sure. So at that point, could negotiation have delayed the war? Well, perhaps. I tend to think that if there had there been stronger diplomatic engagement with Russia, had Russia seen some of its demands being met at that point, then Putin may well have reconsidered, although there's evidence that he was hell-bent on invading Ukraine already, by mid-2021, right? And hardly anything could have swayed him in his decision to invade. But again, there was a certain window for negotiation, but I wouldn't say it was the fault of Olaf Scholz or Boris Johnson or Joseph Biden. Putin could have gone into Ukraine under Angela Merkel, just as he did under Olaf Scholz. In fact, French President Macron scrambled to meet with Putin in the days preceding with the invasion, and there you have this picture of Macron and Putin sitting at two tips of a very, very long table in Moscow. And Putin was essentially at that point making fun of Macron, as transcripts of their conversations indicate. So he at that point, I think he decided to move in. So if something could stop him from invading Ukraine, that would have been his own calculation of risk, as long as attacking a major European country was prone with a huge risk. And that risk indeed materialized. So Russia suffered setbacks in the initial stage of the war. It failed to seize Kiev in a few days as Russia clearly planned at that time. So, only personal calculations of risk at that point could have intervened to stop Putin from the invasion, not any diplomacy, not any concessions that NATO, Ukraine, or whoever could have made at that point already.
Okay, so war breaks out. Here we are. Both sides have lost human lives, uncountable. I can't remember the exact figures off my head. And today we now have a new president in the United States. We have a new prime minister in the UK. We still have Ursula von der Leyen at the EU. However, you now have the president of the United States, Donald Trump, who is clearly, decisively, intentionally, very apparently on the side of President Putin. And then you have Zelensky on the other side. First and foremost, that meeting that happened recently, which happened in Saudi Arabia, Zelensky was supposed to be there and he didn't go. Do you think that was a smart move?
Well, it's still shrouded in mystery as to who invited Zelensky to Riyadh and why he didn't show up. I understand from publications in global media that those were the Saudi hosts who invited, who wanted to have Zelensky, but they didn't have the mandate to actually invite him and make sure he was present, because both the US and Russian delegations wanted to talk one-on-one, so to say. They didn't want Zelensky there. So I'm not sure how that could have become a trilateral negotiation instead of bilateral. It was very important for both the US delegation and the Russian delegation to just meet bilaterally and discuss something that we have very scant information about, really.
Okay. But President Zelensky did say he was not going. And so one can only presume that for you to say you're not going, you must have been invited one way or the other. That's the one thing we can presume, right?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because if you are invited, then it should be made public.
Okay.
Then, the sides coming together, like the Saudis, the hosts, the Russians, the Americans, say, okay, he'd be welcome, and the whole Ukrainian delegation should be welcome. And that was never pronounced. So
Okay.
I don't think really that anyone aside from the hosts wanted the Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh.
Okay, so here we are. President Trump has said, look, the money that America gave you, I want it back, or you give me rare earth in exchange for it. President Trump is trying to negotiate, is attempting to, and he's pretty much, some would argue, in fact, it's widely believed that the deal has already been done. It's just a matter of implementing the negotiation for the ceasefire to end the war. Europe, on the other side, has been left to dry, and Europe is saying, whatever you discuss with Vladimir Putin, you're not going to be able to implement it without Europe, without Ukraine. Is this about to cause the breakdown of this transatlantic, strong, powerful relationship?
Well, I mean, judging by what we've been hearing from the Trump administration and President Trump himself, we might assume we are indeed in the midst of a crisis in transatlantic relations, and not only over approaches to the Ukraine war, but more broadly over, tariffs, over U.S. protections, and maybe even over U.S. membership in NATO. So apparently, President Trump doesn't like the way Europe currently positions within NATO. He thinks Europe is not paying enough for its security, and indeed, quite a few European countries do not have anything that you could call a strong armed force, or they, of course, are falling, behind on their commitments to spend on their own defense and so forth. And so President Trump, whether that's true or not, has this impression that Europe has long been taking advantage of the United States. So it's my impression that he is looking to somehow bring Europe to book, to even punish Europe. And the Ukraine war is one of the sort of bargaining chips or instruments the U.S. now kind of using to ensure a certain realignment with Europe. So Donald Trump has said he wants Europe to take care of its own security and of the guarantees of security for Ukraine should peace be restored between Russia and Ukraine. So it's all intertwined. Donald Trump's interest in ending the war between Russia and Ukraine, Donald Trump's interest in getting concessionary terms for mining rare earth metals and other resources in Ukraine, and then finally Donald Trump's interest in reforming U.S. relations with Europe within NATO.
Okay. NATO, the all-powerful NATO, actually convinced Ukraine to get rid of its nuclear weapons. If Ukraine hadn't gotten rid of its nuclear weapons, would Vladimir Putin had actually declared war and struck first?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So the reality back after the breakup of the USSR was that the United States and newly independent Russia were very much interested in Ukraine just transferring whatever nuclear weapons and nuclear materials Ukraine had on its territory to Russia, so that only Russia would become a nuclear armed state of all the former Soviet republics. So Ukraine didn't really have nuclear weapons at its disposal. It was controlled from Moscow, but then Russia and the United States and the UK came together to kind of convince Moscow, to kind of convince Kiev, Ukraine, to just abandon all, all dreams about getting a status of a nuclear-armed country in the wake of the Soviet breakup. Just one nuclear-armed country, the Soviet Union, kind of gives its or transfers its nuclear weapons to only one successor state, Russia, and Ukraine was kind of left out of that equation. So it wasn't that Ukraine was disarming, it was just transferring its weapons. Having said that, of course, Russia and the UK and the US signed what is known as the Budapest Memorandum in December 1994, which in fact guaranteed Ukraine's security, not just against nuclear blackmail or nuclear attack, but general security in exchange for Ukraine's agreement to sign the non-proliferation treaty, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, as a non-nuclear weapon state. So that was the deal, and you may easily say that it was not delivered upon. Ukraine didn't get the security that it was promised under the Budapest Memorandum.
Indeed. Both sides, are they willing to concede anything at all? What should Russia be conceding? And indeed, you mentioned the agreement that you mentioned before, which was what Vladimir Putin was suggesting as a diplomatic solution. It would appear that's what he's asking for today, and it's what Trump is, signing up to, give or take one or two other items. Is that correct?
I am not sure. Again, we have very scant information as to how the talks are going between Russia and the United States and Ukraine, and there seems to be no talks between Russia and Ukraine directly. So I would assume the United States wants some kind of territorial compromise whereby Russia keeps some of the territories that it seized since 2022, but certainly not not all of them, to make it palatable to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine and NATO might need to forswear membership in NATO for Ukraine, but in exchange of very solid security guarantees. So what we have reliable information about as of today is this agreement that the United States wants to sign with Ukraine about development, about development of Ukraine's natural resources, and Ukraine only wants to sign that agreement if it contains some security guarantees on the part of the United States. That's the best. That's all essentially that we know about the talks or about the terms that the sides in the war are kind of putting forward in any negotiations. And publicly, Russia sticks to its maximalist demands. Again, keeping all the seized territories, and then NATO actually giving guarantees to Russia that Ukraine will never join NATO, and then disarmament of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So aside from that, we haven't heard about any sort of public pushback by the United States against those demands made by Russia, but neither have we heard any terms that Ukraine would consider acceptable if the war were to end. So at this point, unless the talks are ongoing behind the scenes, and unless they've advanced quite far with those compromises being fleshed out and maybe even initially agreed to by the sides, unless that is what is going on behind the scenes, I don't think we are anywhere close to a settlement.
Thank you. I'm going to be coming to your calls after this question. Get ready to call 0201-465-7190, 0201-277-0993, and you should have been sending your messages to 0809-597-5805. We're streaming live on YouTube. Mikhail, one of the accusations or allegations, if you like, against President Zelensky is one, corruption, which is apparently why NATO hasn't, he hasn't been able to join NATO. That's one of the accusations. The other accusation is there was no election. Why hasn't there been an election? Why hasn't there been an election? I'm going to need you to answer that in 1 minute because I know you're going to go soon and I want to fit in as many calls as possible.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So as for corruption, I think the United States has got its anti-corruption arm with the Defense Department or government writ large that rules on how much funds that were transferred by the United States were indeed misappropriated by Ukraine. And I don't think they've rang any alarm bells as to misappropriation of those funds. Now, when it comes to presidential elections in Ukraine, well, it's always good to have a democratically elected leader at the helm, and Ukraine has not had a presidential election since 2019, that's for sure. However, Ukraine has been living under martial law because of the Russian invasion since February 2022. And you cannot hold a presidential election under martial law according to Ukrainian legislation because, apparently Zelensky doesn't want Ukraine to demobilize in the face of Russian, offensive.
Okay.
And so the question is, can you really hold an election in wartime? And is it really a problem? Now, is Zelensky truly so illegitimate? Is he not getting any support among the Ukrainian citizens? And it doesn't look like he's, some kind of a losing candidate. He would be a losing candidate.
So you think he's still popular amongst? You think, in spite of what he said, he's still very popular?
A wartime president is indeed who stands firmly for the interest of Ukraine, is indeed quite popular in Ukraine. We don't know how exactly, but 50% or more for sure.
Okay, you can call now. I'll pick up your phone, your calls as a priority. So your questions must be short, precise, succinct. Please, nothing long. Hello. 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 Hello.
Hello.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good evening.
Good evening, rather.
My question is, number one, NATO without US, is NATO without US a lame dog? That's one. Number two, you see, Kastama and Macron are planning to deploy troops on the borders of Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's different from NATO arrangement. Does he think that UK can do all of that given their financial problems right now?
Okay, thank you. That's actually an excellent question. It's something that I was discussing this week. Keir Starmer had said they could put boots on the ground, right? Keir Starmer and Macron. However, the UK does have a serious economic financial issues. His question was, Titilope's question is, do you think they would be able to do that, in your opinion?
Well, I think, of course, such great powers as the UK and France do have enough, financial means and enough manpower to put boots on the ground. The question is political more than financial. So under which terms of engagement those, say, peacekeepers should be deployed? What if a provocation happens? What if they come under an attack by either Ukraine or Russia, or you even don't know whom? So what should they do in response? Should they just withdraw, which would be the norm for, say, UN peacekeepers? They just withdraw, and then what's the point in deploying them in the first place? Or should they fight back? But if they should fight back, then Britain or France or both become engaged in this war, become involved in the war with Russia, for example.
Indeed. Russia has said if NATO puts boots on the ground, then they see that as a wider declaration of the war, which makes it all the more dangerous. I have a question here from Taiwo, who said, kindly ask your guest this question. Is Ukraine a sovereign state or a country? If yes, why is Russia still dictating for Ukrainians whether to join NATO or not?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I mean, of course, Ukraine would always said it should have the right to choose its alliances, and it's clear that any sovereign state has the right to choose its alliances. Now, Russia insists that, because it's a great power and because it deals directly with the European Union and the United States in its status of a great power, then Russia's interests, security interests, should be respected. And in fact, NATO and the United States and the European Union have gone a long way to try and assuage Russia's security concerns. NATO signed a series of agreements with Russia, and in fact, Russia's relations with NATO were quite good some 10 years ago, 15 years ago. When Putin became president, he even kind of floated the possibility of Russia joining NATO. So it wasn't like NATO was perceived in Russia as a mortal threat all the way, right? So yeah, I agree with the notion that everyone has the right to choose their alliances. That said, diplomacy is sometimes messy. So as you see, EU states, the United States, other mediators did sort of broach the possibility of negotiating Ukraine's status with Russia. Back in 2010s, it led nowhere. For sure, but indeed, Ukraine has all the right to choose its alliances. The fact is that Ukraine was nowhere close to joining NATO in 2022 when Russia attacked. It would have been a very, very long way for Ukraine and many countries in the EU.
But can I ask you a question? Do you think President Vladimir Putin was provoked? Because it would appear, what some could argue that they kept poking and poking and poking at him till he became this bear with a sore head and just charged. Would you agree to that? You don't think so?
I don't think he was provoked. Again, Russia under Putin at certain points in its post-Cold War history had very good relations with NATO. Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO again anytime soon. Then Putin moved to, seize Crimea in 2014 from Ukraine. At that point, Ukraine started feeling truly insecure, and then they applied to join NATO. But what kind of threat sort of emanated from Ukraine, even by 2022, when Ukrainian nationalism was quite strong and Ukraine sought to punish Russia, for diplomatically for annexing Crimea. Even at that point, I couldn't see any serious threat coming from
But that was Viktor Yanukovych, who was very much Putin friendly. Then you had the election that brought in Zelensky, who is very West friendly, and all of a sudden things changed. Do you see my point? Right? So had Viktor Yanukovych, I think that Yanukovych, had he continued, would we have had this war, is the question.
It's a little bit different. Yanukovych was gone by 2014. He left Ukraine, fled Ukraine at the time when Russia moved to seize Crimea and annex it. Then Ukraine had some hardline nationalist president who wanted to restore Ukraine's control over the territories it was losing. But then Zelensky was elected in 2019 on the wave of making peace with Russia. He actually promised a settlement with Russia. He said that we should just stop shooting on the line of control in eastern Ukraine, and I'll be able to figure it out with Putin. And then very soon it became clear that there were no agreeable terms on which he could figure Russia-Ukraine relations with Putin. But Zelensky was a candidate of a peaceful settlement with Russia.
And this is why I'm going to interrupt you, because we've only got 2 minutes left. That when Boris Johnson, at the point when Vladimir Zelensky wanted to actually talk peace, he got a visit from Boris Johnson, who said to him, well, pretty much, I'm paraphrasing again, go ahead and fight. We're behind you, right? Should he have listened? This is what I'm saying. Should he have listened to the West? Or should he have just said, you know what? Putin is my brother. I'm going to go and talk to him. And let me see how far I get. Because the West kept saying to him, we are behind you. He also got a visit, I think, from Kamala Harris. So it was all pushed to fight.
Yeah, well, at that
we
point...
have 1 minute left, yes.
Okay, yeah, he was exploring his options for sure. He could have settled possibly on very unfavorable terms, like, reducing Ukrainian army to just nothing and, forswearing the NATO option and maybe even ceding territory to Russia at that point. So he faced that choice and he decided to fight. I mean, and I think in Ukraine, the sentiment was quite strong in support of fighting back at that point. And we still do not know enough as to what actually stopped the peace talks in April 2022. Was it, Zelensky's intransigence? And I really doubt so.
Mikhail Troitskiy, visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining us. You've got to come back because I have more questions. We haven't finished. Do you promise to come back?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and just let me know.
Excellent. Thank you.
Goodbye.
After this.
How do we make up?
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.